The sun over the Arizona Territory in the late summer of 1878 was not merely a source of light, but a physical weight, a hammer that beat against the earth until the ground cracked and the air shimmered with heat. Here, on the lonely southern edge of the territory, the town of Red Rock sat pressed between towering sandstone mesas and deep, dry arroyos that only saw water during the violent flash floods of July. It was a thin, fragile line of weather-beaten buildings, a saloon, a whitewashed church with a peeling steeple, a general store, and a livery stable, all huddled together as if for protection against the sheer vastness of the landscape. The sky above was a relentless, blinding blue, big enough to swallow a person's hope without leaving a trace. Dust coated everything. It settled in the creases of men's necks, drifted across the polished mahogany of the saloon bar, and dulled the black coats of the Sunday churchgoers. It was a fine, red grit that tasted of iron and ancient stone, and Maggie O'Connell could feel it grinding between her teeth as she walked the half-mile path from the creek back to her cabin. Maggie was 28 years old, though the harsh frontier sun and the grief she carried made her look older around the eyes. She was a healer and a midwife, a woman who lived on the periphery of the town's society, tolerated for her skills but viewed with suspicion for her independence. Her cabin stood alone, separated from the main cluster of town buildings by a stretch of scrub brush and cactus. It was a small structure of rough-hewn logs and adobe, with a roof that leaked during the winter rains and a garden out back that required a daily war against the elements to survive. She paused now, setting down the two heavy wooden buckets of water, her breath coming in short gasps. Her hands, resting on her hips, were red and chapped, the skin around her fingernails stained permanently with the green of crushed herbs and the brown of dried earth. She wore a faded calico dress that had once been blue but was now a nondescript gray, hemmed and patched more times than she could count. Yet, beneath the worn brim of her bonnet, her eyes were sharp and observant, the color of wet river stones. They were the eyes of a woman who had seen the worst the world could offer and had decided, with stubborn quietness, to keep standing. Maggie lifted the buckets again, the rope handles biting into her palms, and continued toward her door. Every step was a reminder of what she had lost to this land. Her history was written in the small, wooden crosses in the town cemetery, a place she visited only when the guilt became too heavy to bear alone. First, it had been her parents, Irish immigrants who had come west chasing rumors of silver and found only typhoid fever in a crowded wagon train. Then it had been Liam, her husband. He had been a strong man with a laugh that shook the walls, a miner who believed his fortune was just one swing of a pickaxe away. The mine owners had skimped on timber supports to save money, and the mountain had collapsed on him and 12 others. Maggie had waited at the mine entrance for 3 days, listening to the silence, until the foreman told her there was no point in digging out the dead, but the wound that refused to heal, the one that woke her in the middle of the night with a gasp caught in her throat, was the death of her son, Samuel. He had been 4 years old, a bright-eyed boy with Liam's dark hair, when the fever took him, burning him up from the inside. Maggie had run all the way to town in the dead of night to pound on the doctor's door. Dr. Evans was a man who served the wealthy ranchers and the mining supervisors. He had looked at Maggie's frantic face, at her ragged clothes, and had shaken his head. He told her it was too far to ride for a poor woman who likely could not pay his fee, and that he had paying patients to attend to in the morning. He had closed the door in her face. Samuel died just before dawn, his small hand going limp in hers. Maggie had buried him herself, digging the grave in the hard earth behind her cabin because she could not bear to put him in the town plot near the man who had let him die. That loss had forged something hard and cold inside her, but it also ignited a fire. She had learned the uses of willow bark and sage, of yucca root and clean bandages. She became the one the poor turned to, the miners' wives, the driftwood laborers, the girls who worked in the saloon. She healed them obsessively, fighting death with a ferocity that bordered on madness, as if every life she saved could somehow balance the scales for the son she had lost. She reached her cabin and poured the water into the barrel by the door. Wiping her brow, she looked toward the town. The heat waves distorted the buildings, making them look like a mirage. Even from here, she could sense the tension that had gripped Red Rock for weeks. Later that afternoon, Maggie walked into town to trade eggs and dried herbs for flour. The atmosphere in the general store was thick, and not just from the heat. 2 men stood by the counter, their boots dusty, rifles leaning against their legs. One of them, a man named Henderson with a scar running through his beard, spat into the brass spittoon. "I tell you, the only way we are going to sleep soundly is if the colonel drives every last one of them into Mexico or into the ground," Henderson said, his voice loud enough to carry to the back where Maggie was inspecting a sack of cornmeal. "They are like coyotes. You cannot tame a coyote. You shoot it." The storekeeper nodded. Weighing a bag of sugar, heard the cavalry is sweeping the canyon to the east. Maybe they will catch that band that hit the supply wagons last week. Maggie kept her head down, her fingers tightening around the fabric of the flour sack. She hated this talk. She hated the casual way they spoke of killing, as if the Apaches were not men with families but vermin to be exterminated. But she said nothing. She knew her place in this town was precarious. A woman alone, a woman who healed the poor, was already suspect. To speak out in defense of the enemy would be to invite ruin. She paid for her flour and left, stepping back out into the blinding street. As she passed the small wooden church, she heard the booming voice of the new preacher, Reverend Silas. He was practicing his sermon for Sunday. The doors propped open to catch a breeze that did not exist. "The heathen is a scourge upon the land," Silas shouted to the empty pews, "and woe to those who show mercy to the servants of darkness. Woe to the white woman who forgets her purity and her place, for she invites the devil into her heart." Maggie shivered despite the heat. The Reverend often looked at her with narrow, accusing eyes when she walked past. He did not like that she lived without a husband. He did not like that she knew the bodies of men and women in ways only a healer does. She hurried her pace, wanting only to be back in the safety of her cabin. But as she passed the livery stable, a shadow detached itself from the wall and blocked her path. "Good afternoon, Maggie." She stopped, clutching her parcel to her chest. It was Elijah Carter. Elijah was a handsome man in a sharp, predatory way. He was in his mid-30s, the owner of the largest cattle ranch in the valley. He wore a clean white shirt and a vest of fine leather, and his boots were polished despite the dust. He had been pursuing Maggie for 6 months, ever since his own wife died of childbirth complications, a death Maggie had not been called for until it was too late. "Good afternoon." "Mr. Carter," Maggie said, keeping her voice neutral. He stepped closer. Invading her space, he smelled of bay rum and expensive tobacco. "You look tired. Maggie, that cabin is too much work for a woman alone. I saw you hauling water earlier. It is not right." "I manage well enough," she said, trying to step around him. He moved to block her again, a smile on his face that did not reach his eyes. "I have told you before, you do not need to manage. I can offer you a good life. Security, protection. My house has a well right by the kitchen door. You would not have to work your hands raw." It was a proposal, but it sounded like a transaction. Elijah did not want a partner. He wanted a possession. He wanted a wife to manage his house and warm his bed, someone he could own just as he owned his cattle and his land. Maggie felt a cold knot in her stomach. "I am grateful for your concern, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady. "But I cherish my independence. I am not looking to marry again." Elijah's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of irritation. "Independence is a dangerous thing for a woman out here. Maggie, people talk. They wonder why a widow prefers to live like a hermit rather than accept the protection of a decent man. Let them talk," Maggie said. "I have work to do. Good day, Mr. Carter." She pushed past him this time, not waiting for permission. As she walked away, she could feel his eyes boring into her back. It was not a look of longing. It was the look of a man who was used to getting what he wanted and was insulted that he had been denied. By the time she reached her cabin, the sun was beginning to dip toward the western horizon. turning the sky a bruised purple. She fed her few chickens and chopped kindling for the stove, her mind churning with the day's encounters. The prejudice in the town, the aggression of the men, the suffocating heat. It all felt like a trap closing in on her. Distant thunder rolled across the valley. Maggie paused, axe in hand, looking south, but it was not thunder. On the horizon, miles away, thin pillars of black smoke rose into the darkening sky. Then came the sound, faint, popping noises like dry twigs snapping. Gunfire! She stood frozen, watching the smoke curl against the first stars. A skirmish. The cavalry had found someone. That evening, the mood in Red Rock shifted from tension to a feverish excitement. From her porch, Maggie could hear the sounds of celebration drifting from the town. The piano in the saloon was playing a jaunty tune, and men were shouting. Rumors traveled fast on the frontier wind. The soldiers had cornered a band of Apaches. They were celebrating the dead before the bodies were even cold. Maggie did not celebrate. She sat on her porch steps, staring into the dark, her heart heavy. She knew what those sounds meant. Somewhere out in the desert, men were screaming. Somewhere, women were weeping over bodies that would be left for the buzzards. The celebration in town grew louder, a raucous noise that felt obscene against the silence of the desert. Unable to bear the sound, Maggie stood up. She needed to walk. She needed the clean, cold air of the night to wash the town's cruelty from her mind. She walked away from the lights of Red Rock, heading toward the dry wash that cut through the land a quarter-mile behind her cabin. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, casting long, twisted shadows among the mesquite and sagebrush. The desert wind had picked up, cold and sharp, biting through her thin shawl. It hissed through the needles of the cacti, a lonely sound that made the world feel vast and indifferent to human suffering. Maggie walked with her head down, watching for rattlesnakes, her boots crunching softly on the gravel. She was thinking of Samuel. He had been afraid of the dark. She wondered if he was afraid where he was now, in the cold earth behind her house. A sound broke her reverie. It was a low, guttural groan. Maggie stopped dead. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The sound had come from the deep shadows of the wash, where the floodwaters had carved out a hollow beneath the roots of an old ironwood tree. Her first instinct was to run. A groan in the dark meant danger. It could be a drunk from town, or an outlaw, or worse. The wise thing, the safe thing, was to turn around and flee to her cabin, to bolt the door and blow out the lamp. But she did not run. She was a healer. The sound of pain was a language she understood better than any other. She took a step forward, then another. "Is someone there?" she whispered. There was no answer, only the sound of ragged, wet breathing. Maggie moved closer, sliding down the shallow bank of the wash. The moonlight struggled to reach the bottom, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw a shape huddled against the earth. It was a man. He was lying on his side, half hidden by a cluster of rocks. Maggie knelt beside him, her fear warring with her training. She reached out a trembling hand to touch his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man shifted, a sudden, violent spasm. He rolled onto his back, and a shaft of moonlight fell across his face. Maggie recoiled, a gasp stifled in her throat. He was not a man from town. He had long, black hair loose around his shoulders, and his face, though twisted in agony, held the high cheekbones and dark skin of the people the town wanted dead. He was Apache. Maggie scrambled back, her hands scraping against the gravel. Terror, cold and absolute, washed over her. This was the enemy. This was the monster the preacher warned about. The savage Henderson boasted of shooting. If she was found here with him, if the soldiers came. The warrior's eyes opened. They were dark, obsidian black, and filled with a mixture of hatred and terrified exhaustion. He looked at her, and then his hand moved weakly to his belt, searching for a knife that was not there. He let out a hiss of frustration and pain, his head falling back against the sand. Maggie stared at him. He was young, perhaps 30, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing. His leg was a ruin, a gunshot wound in the thigh that had bled heavily, the dark stain soaking his buckskin leggings and the sand beneath him. His shirt was torn, revealing bruises on his ribs that looked deep and dangerous, likely from a fall from a horse. He was dying. Maggie looked back toward the town. She could still hear the faint tinkling of the piano. The doctor was there, drinking whiskey, safe and warm. He would not come for a white child. He certainly would not come for this man. If she left him, he would be dead by morning. The coyotes were already singing in the hills, scenting blood. Maggie looked back at the warrior. He was watching her, waiting for her to run, waiting for the bluecoats to come and finish him. There was no pleading in his eyes, only a hard, defiant acceptance of his fate. And in that look, Maggie saw something that shattered her resolve to flee. She saw a human being who was alone, in pain, and abandoned by the world. She remembered the small, hot hand of her son as he lay dying. She remembered begging for help that never came. "I cannot do it," she whispered to the wind. "I cannot be like them." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She moved back to his side. The warrior flinched, his muscles tensing, but he was too weak to fight her. "I am not going to hurt you," she said softly. Her voice trembled, but she forced it to be firm. "I am a healer. I am going to help you." He stared at her, uncomprehending, but the tone of her voice seemed to reach him. Maggie knew she could not treat him here. It was too exposed. She had to get him to the cabin. It was madness. It was treason. It was a hanging offense. She put her arm under his shoulders. "You have to help me," she said, panting with the effort. "You have to try to stand." It was a nightmare of exertion. The man was heavy, dead weight with muscle and bone. He groaned through gritted teeth as she hauled him up, his injured leg dragging uselessly. He leaned his entire weight on her, his arm draped over her shoulders, his sweat smelling of copper and sage. Step by step, they climbed out of the wash. Every shadow looked like a soldier. Every rustle of the wind sounded like an approaching horse. Maggie was terrified. If Elijah rode by now, if a patrol came checking the outskirts. She dragged him across the open ground, her boots slipping in the dust. The warrior was barely conscious now, his feet stumbling. "Keep moving," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. Just a little farther. They reached the back of her cabin. Maggie kicked open the cellar doors, slanted wooden flaps that led into the earth. The cellar was where she kept her root vegetables and jars of preserves. It was cool, dark, and the only place she could hide him. She helped him down the steep wooden steps, almost falling with him. At the bottom, she laid him on a pile of old burlap sacks she used for potatoes. He collapsed with a shuddering exhale and went still. Maggie scrambled back up the stairs, closed the cellar doors, and threw earth over the cracks to hide the light. Then she ran inside the cabin, bolted the door, and grabbed her medical bag and a lantern. She filled a basin with water and grabbed a bottle of whiskey. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the matches as she lit the lantern in the cellar. The golden light flickered over the small, damp space. It smelled of earth and onions. The warrior lay on the sacks, his eyes closed. Maggie knelt beside him. She cut away the blood-soaked leather of his leggings with her shears. The wound was ugly. The bullet had passed through, but it had torn the muscle badly. It was swollen and angry. She worked quickly. She washed the wound with water, the warrior hissing in his breath but making no outcry. She poured whiskey over the raw flesh to cleanse it. His body jerked, his back arching off the sacks, a guttural word escaping his lips in a language she did not know. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears springing to her eyes. "I'm sorry. I know it hurts." She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow and goldenrod to stop the bleeding and fight infection, then bound it tight with strips of clean linen. She checked his ribs. They were badly bruised, perhaps cracked, but his lungs seemed clear. She worked for an hour, cleaning him, checking for other injuries. Up close, she saw the map of his life written on his skin. He had faded blue tattoos on his arms, geometric lines and symbols. He had old scars, white ridges of healed flesh on his chest and arms that spoke of a life of constant warfare. When she was finished, she covered him with an old wool blanket. He was shivering, the shock setting in. Maggie sat back on her heels, wiping her bloody hands on her apron. She looked at his face. The hatred had faded into unconsciousness, leaving him looking younger, vulnerable. She blew out the lantern, leaving him in the dark, and climbed the stairs, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Back in her cabin, Maggie scrubbed the blood from her hands until her skin was raw. She checked the windows, peering out into the night. The town was quiet now. The celebration was over. She lay down on her narrow bed, but sleep was impossible. Directly beneath her, separated only by thin floorboards and a layer of earth, lay an Apache warrior. She listened. She could hear the faint, labored sound of his breathing rising through the floor. Outside, a coyote howled, a long, mournful sound that echoed off the mesas. Maggie pulled the quilt up to her chin, staring at the ceiling. She had saved a life tonight, but in doing so, she had put a noose around her own neck. The fear pressed down on her chest, heavy as the desert night. She was no longer just a healer. She was a keeper of a secret that could burn her world to ash. The morning sun rose over the red mesas with a vengeance, bleaching the color from the sky until it was a hard, relentless white. Maggie O'Connell moved through the motions of her daily life with a terrifying normalcy that felt brittle, as if one wrong step would shatter it into 1,000 sharp pieces. She scattered corn for the chickens, the dry kernels hitting the packed earth with a rhythmic click that sounded too loud in the morning stillness. She pumped water from the well, the iron handle groaning in protest, and carried the heavy buckets to her small garden where the squash and beans fought a losing battle against the heat. To anyone watching from the road, she was simply the widow O'Connell, tending her patch of dust. But inside, her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every time the wind rattled the loose shutter on the west window, her breath hitched. Every time a hawk screeched overhead, she flinched. The secret beneath her floorboards felt massive, a physical weight that pressed up against the soles of her boots. She was scrubbing a shirt in a tin washtub on the porch when she saw the dust cloud rising from the direction of town. It was moving fast, resolving quickly into the shapes of men on horseback. Maggie wiped her soapy hands on her apron, her mouth suddenly dry. She forced herself to stand still, to keep her face open and curious, the way an innocent woman would look. The patrol slowed as they approached her fence. There were 6 of them, United States cavalry, their blue uniforms coated in the ubiquitous gray dust of the territory. Their horses looked tired, heads low, tails flicking lazily at flies. The leader, a lieutenant with a sunburned nose and a mustache that drooped at the corners, rode up to the gate. He tipped his hat, but his eyes were hard and searching. "Good morning, ma'am," the lieutenant said. "Good morning, Lieutenant," Maggie replied. Her voice sounded steady, which surprised her. "Can I help you? We are sweeping the area for stragglers," he said, leaning forward on his saddle horn. "Had a scrap with a band of Chiricahua yesterday. Some of them scattered. We are looking for wounded. Have you seen any sign of Indians? Any tracks? Anyone trying to steal water?" Maggie gripped the fence rail, feeling the rough wood bite into her palms. She thought of the man lying in the dark beneath her feet, the smell of his blood, the look in his eyes. "I have not seen a soul, Lieutenant," she said. "I was in town yesterday evening for supplies. Since I came home, it has been just me and the chickens." The lieutenant looked past her, scanning the small cabin, the woodpile, the outhouse. He looked at the cellar doors, which were closed and covered with a scattering of straw she had artfully arranged earlier. "They are slippery," he muttered. "If you see anything, ma'am, you do not engage. You ride for town. These ones are desperate. They will kill you for a horse or a canteen of water." "I understand," Maggie said. "I will keep my Winchester loaded." "Good," he said. He signaled to his men, "Stay safe, ma'am." They turned their horses and rode on, heading west toward the canyon. Maggie watched them go until they were nothing but a smudge of dust on the horizon. Only then did she let her knees unlock. She sank down onto the porch steps, trembling so violently that her teeth chattered. She had looked the law in the eye and lied, and in that moment, she had crossed a line from which there was no return. When her pulse finally slowed, she checked the road one last time, locked the front door, and went to the cellar. She descended the ladder, the air growing cooler and smelling of damp earth and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. She had left him a jar of water and a piece of cornbread, but when she lit the lantern, she saw the food was untouched. The water jar was empty. The warrior lay exactly where she had left him. His eyes were open, glittering in the lamplight, tracking her every movement. He looked feverish, his skin possessing a gray, unhealthy pallor beneath the deep tan. Maggie set the lantern on an upturned crate. "I need to look at the leg," she said. He did not speak, but he did not stop her when she lifted the blanket. The bandage was stiff with dried blood. She soaked it off carefully with warm water, wincing in sympathy as the cloth pulled at the skin. When the wound was exposed, she let out a slow breath. It was not infected. Not yet, but the damage to the muscle was severe. The bullet had torn through the meat of the thigh, disrupting the natural lines of the sinew. As she probed gently with her fingers, she felt the muscle beneath the skin seizing up. Hard as a stone, it was contracting, pulling tight in defense against the injury. Maggie froze. A memory, unbidden and agonizing, rose in her mind. She saw her son, Samuel, in his small bed, his body racked with fever. She remembered how his limbs had stiffened in the hours before the end, how his small legs had become rigid as the life burned out of him. She remembered the doctor saying there was nothing to be done, that the body was shutting down. She looked at the warrior's leg. If that muscle healed while clenched so tight, it would scar into a useless knot. He would be crippled. He would never walk without a crutch, never ride, never run. For a man of his people, that would be a death sentence. She would not watch another body fail, not if she had the power to stop it. She looked up at him. His face was a mask of pain. His jaw set so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. "The wound is clean," Maggie said, keeping her voice low and professional. "But the muscle is tightening. If we let it heal like this, you will be a cripple. You will not walk." He stared at her, unblinking. He understood the tone, if not all the words. "I have to work the muscle," she said, making a kneading motion with her hands. "I have to keep it soft. It will hurt, but it is the only way." She reached for a jar of salve she had brought down, a mixture of rendered lard, arnica, and crushed sage. She warmed a dollop of it between her palms. When she reached for his leg, he flinched violently, his hand shooting out to grip her wrist. His fingers were like iron bands. He growled something low in his throat, a warning. He did not trust her. Why should he? She was a white woman, the enemy, the one whose people had put that bullet in him. Maggie did not pull away. She met his gaze, her own eyes steady and stubborn. "I am not trying to hurt you," she said firmly. "I am trying to save your leg. Do you want to drag it behind you like a dead branch for the rest of your life?" He searched her face, looking for the lie, looking for the treachery. He saw only the weary determination of a woman who had seen too much death. Slowly, very slowly, his grip on her wrist loosened. He let his hand fall back to the sacking. He gave a sharp nod. Maggie took a breath and placed her hands on his thigh. Just above the bandage, the contact was electric. His skin was burning hot, the muscle beneath it vibrating with tension. As she began to press, digging her thumbs into the tight cords of flesh, he arched his back, a hiss of air escaping through his teeth. "I know," she whispered. "I know." For the next hour, the cellar was a silent battleground. Maggie worked with a strength she did not know she possessed, pushing, kneading, forcing the blood to flow, forcing the fibers to stretch. The smell of the salve mixed with the scent of the cellar, the damp earth, the onions, the metallic blood, and the clean scent of her lye soap. The warrior did not cry out. He squeezed his eyes shut, sweat beading on his forehead and running into his hair. His hands gripped the edges of the burlap sacks until his knuckles turned white. To distract him, and perhaps to distract herself from the intimacy of touching a man she barely knew, Maggie began to talk. "It is hot outside," she said, her voice soft and monotonous. "The corn is dying. I do not think we will get rain until late September. My father used to say the weather in this country was God's way of testing us. He said if you could survive the heat, you could survive anything." She talked about the chickens. She talked about the price of flour. She talked about nothing at all, letting the words flow over him like a cool stream. By the time she finished, her arms ached and her fingers were cramping. The warrior lay exhausted, his chest heaving, but the muscle in his leg felt more pliable, less like stone. Maggie wiped her hands on a rag. "I will come back tomorrow night," she said. "We have to do this every night." He opened his eyes and looked at her. The hatred was gone, replaced by a wary confusion. He gave a slight nod, barely perceptible. Maggie took the lantern and climbed the stairs, leaving him in the dark. Over the next week, a rhythm formed, born of necessity and secrecy. During the day, Maggie was the widow O'Connell. She washed clothes for the miners, scrubbed floors, and walked into town with her head high, ignoring the whispers. She sat in the front row of the church on Sunday and listened to the new preacher, Reverend Silas, thunder from the pulpit. Silas was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed to burn with a cold. Blue fire. He paced the front of the church, slamming his Bible down on the lectern. "We are surrounded by darkness," he shouted, his voice echoing off the wooden beams. "The heathen sits at our doorstep, sharpening his blade, and there are those among us who lack the steel to do what must be done. We must drive them out. We must purify this land." He spoke of the sanctity of white womanhood, of the danger of corruption. Maggie felt his gaze sweep over the congregation and pause, just for a second, on her. She kept her face impassive, but her hands trembled in her lap. She felt branded. She felt as though the secret in her cellar was written in scarlet letters across her forehead. But when night fell, the town and its hatred faded away. Maggie would lock her doors, pull the curtains tight, and descend into the earth. The cellar became a world unto itself, a small, candlelit bubble suspended in time. She would check his wound, change the dressing, and then begin the massage. The awkwardness of the first night slowly began to wear away, replaced by a strange, quiet familiarity. Her hands learned the map of his body. She knew where the old scars lay, white and jagged against his skin. She knew where the tension gathered at the base of his spine. She knew the texture of his hair, black and coarse, where it brushed against her arm. He began to trust her hands. He no longer flinched when she touched him. Instead, he would close his eyes and breathe deeply, his body surrendering to the relief she brought. And they began to speak. It started with names. "Maggie," she said one night, pointing to herself. He watched her, his dark eyes reflecting the lantern flame. "Maggie," he repeated. The name sounded strange on his tongue, the syllables soft and foreign. He pointed to his chest. "Nantan, Nantan," she said. It sounded strong, grounded. He told her he was Chiricahua. He told her, in halting English mixed with hand gestures, about his home. He spoke of mountains that were green with pine, of streams that ran cold and clear, of a place where the wind did not taste of dust. One night, while she worked a particularly stubborn knot in his calf, he asked the question that had been hanging between them. "Why?" he asked. He looked at her, his expression intense. "You are white. I am enemy." "Why you help?" Maggie paused, her thumbs resting on his skin. She looked at the shadows dancing on the earthen walls. She thought of the lieutenant, of the preacher, of the men in the saloon. "I found you," she said simply. "You were dying. Let die," he said harshly. "Better than this, better than cage." "I am not keeping you in a cage," Maggie said. "I am keeping you from a rope." He watched her. "White people kill Apache." He said, "Apache kill white people. That is the way. It is a bad way," Maggie said. She looked down at her hands on his dark skin. "My son, Samuel, he was 4 years old. He got sick, the fever. I went to the doctor in town. He was a white man, a man of my own people. He would not come. He said it was too far. He let my boy die because I was poor." Her voice cracked on the last word. She had not spoken of it to anyone in town. They all knew, but they did not speak of it. Nantan lay still. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before resting lightly on her arm. "My wife," he said. His voice was low, a rumble in his chest. "Her name was Alope. Soldiers come to village. We are gone. Hunting. Soldiers burn tippies. They shoot women. They shoot children." He stopped, his throat working. A muscle jumped in his jaw. "My wife," he said again. "She carry baby. Not born yet. Soldiers kill her. Kill baby inside." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Maggie looked at him, horror washing over her. She saw the raw, gaping wound in his soul, a wound far deeper than the bullet hole in his leg. "My brother," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it worse. He tried to give up, surrender, walk to fort with white flag. Soldiers shoot him for sport, laughing. He looked at Maggie, his eyes burning. Officers sign paper, treaty, say land is ours. Then settlers come, take water, take cows. Officers say paper is mistake. Paper means nothing. Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. She saw the scars on his body in a new light. They were not just from battle. They were a history of betrayal. They were the marks of a man who had been pushed and pushed and pushed until there was nowhere left to go but war. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry." Nantan looked at her. He saw the grief in her face, the genuine pain for his loss. His expression softened. For the first time, the wall between them, the wall of race and war and history, seemed to crumble just a little. "Pain is same," he said quietly. "Tears taste same." "Yes," Maggie said. "Yes, they do." That night, when she went upstairs, she felt a connection to him that terrified her. He was no longer a stranger. He was a man who carried the same weight of loss that she did. Outside, the world was growing harder. Elijah Carter came to the cabin 3 days later. He rode up on a massive black stallion, looking every inch the lord of the valley. Maggie was in the garden, weeding the rows of struggling beans. He dismounted and walked to the fence, taking off his hat. The sun glinted off his polished belt buckle. "You look terrible." "Maggie," he said bluntly. "Thank you." "Elijah," she said, not looking up. "I mean it. You have circles under your eyes dark enough to store grain in. You are working yourself to death out here." "I am fine." "Elijah, you are not fine." He opened the gate and stepped into the yard. Maggie stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, her heart starting its familiar panicked rhythm. "I heard Reverend Silas yesterday," Elijah said. "He is right. You know, this is no country for a woman alone. It changes people. It makes them vulnerable." "What do you want?" "Elijah?" she asked, her patience fraying. "I want you to be sensible," he said. "I want you to marry me. I can hire help for this place. Or we can burn it down and you can live at the ranch house. You would have dresses, Maggie. You would have rest. You would have protection. And what would I have to give up?" she asked. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You would give up this foolish pride. You would belong to someone. There is a comfort in that, Maggie." His eyes swept over her, possessive and cold. He did not see her. He saw a mare he wanted to break. He saw a piece of land he wanted to fence in. And, he added, his voice turning hard, "It would stop the talk." "What talk?" Maggie asked sharply. "People wonder," Elijah said. "They wonder why you're so reclusive. They wonder where you go at night. Some folks say they have seen a light in your cellar late. It is strange behavior. Maggie, dangerous behavior." Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. He had been watching. Or someone had. "I preserve vegetables at night," she lied, her voice tight. "It is the coolest time to work." Elijah studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a thin, humorless curving of his lips. "Of course, vegetables. Just think about my offer. Maggie, the world is getting dangerous. You do not want to be on the wrong side of it." He tipped his hat and walked away. Maggie watched him ride off, a cold chill settling deep in her bones. He was not asking anymore. He was threatening. He knew something, or he suspected enough to be dangerous. That night, the fear was a living thing in the cellar. Maggie felt jumpy, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. Nantan sensed it. He watched her closely as she prepared the salve. "Bad day?" he asked. "A man," she said. "A man who wants to own me. He asks questions." Nantan made a low sound of disgust. Maggie began the massage. She started on his ankle, working her way up the calf. Her mind was racing, replaying Elijah's words, replaying the look in the lieutenant's eyes. She felt trapped. She felt as if the walls of the cellar were closing in on her. She moved her hands up to his thigh, kneading the long muscle. Nantan was healing. The swelling was down, the heat gone. His leg was strong again, the muscle defined and hard beneath her fingers. She worked higher, moving to his hip, and then to his lower back. He lay on his stomach, his head resting on his folded arms. Maggie's hands moved up his spine, working out the tension in his shoulders. She was not thinking about what she was doing. She was lost in her fear. Her fingers traced the line of his ribs, feeling the rise and fall of his breath. Her hand slipped. Her fingers brushed against a scar on his side, just below his ribs. It was a sensitive spot, an old arrow wound or a knife cut. Nantan inhaled sharply, his whole body jerking. "Oh," Maggie gasped. "I'm sorry, She started to pull her hand away, embarrassed by her clumsiness, but his hand shot out. He did not grab her roughly. His fingers wrapped around her wrist, firm and warm. He stopped her retreat. For a moment, time simply stopped. The lantern flickered. The smell of earth and soap filled the small space. Maggie could feel the calluses on his palm against the soft skin of her inner wrist. She could feel his pulse beating against her fingertips, where her hand still rested on his side. He turned his head, looking up at her. His face was inches from hers. His eyes were dark pools, bottomless and searching. They were not the eyes of an enemy. They were not the eyes of a patient. They were the eyes of a man looking at a woman. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Her heart, which had been beating with fear, gave a strange, violent lurch and began to beat with something else entirely. Heat rushed up her neck, flooding her cheeks. She should pull away. She should stand up, apologize, and go upstairs. She should remember who he was and who she was. But she could not move. Nantan's thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, sending a shiver racing down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Your hands," he whispered. His voice was rough, like gravel sliding down a slope. "What about them?" she breathed. "You touch." He struggled for the words. "You touch not just leg. You touch. Here." He pressed her hand against his ribs, over his heart. "You wake something," he said. "Something that was dead." Maggie stared at him. Her lips parted. The words hit her like a physical blow. She felt a sudden, overwhelming rush of longing, a hunger she had suppressed for years, buried under grief and hard work and widow's weeds. She realized, with a jolt of terrifying clarity, that she had not just been healing him, she had been memorizing him. She knew the curve of his shoulder. She knew the texture of his skin. She knew the sound of his breathing. She had been starving for touch, for tenderness, for a connection that went deeper than duty. And he was looking at her as if she were the only water in a desert. The air in the cellar crackled with a tension that was sudden and absolute. It was dangerous. It was forbidden. It was insanity. Maggie pulled her hand away, scrambling backward. The spell broke, shattering into 1,000 shards of panic. I have to go," she stammered. "I have to. The fire. Upstairs." She grabbed the lantern, her hands shaking so badly the light danced wildly on the walls. She did not look at him. She could not. If she looked at him again, she would not leave. "Rest," she whispered. She fled up the stairs, stumbling in her haste. She slammed the cellar doors shut and threw the bolt. She ran into her cabin and leaned against the door, gasping for air as if she had run a mile. Outside, the desert wind battered the shutters, rattling the latch. Maggie blew out the lantern and collapsed onto her bed, fully clothed. She stared up into the darkness. Her wrist still burned where he had touched her. Her hand still tingled with the memory of his heartbeat. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her knuckles against her mouth to stifle a sob. She was Maggie O'Connell, a decent woman, a widow. He was Nantan, a Chiricahua warrior, a man her town wanted to hang. They were enemies. The world had drawn a line in the sand between them that was written in blood and history. But as she lay there, listening to the wind howl, she knew the terrifying truth. The line had been crossed, and she wanted him to cross it again. The news hit Red Rock like a hammer blow to the chest, knocking the wind out of the town's fragile peace. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, carried by a rider whose horse was frothed with white sweat and whose eyes were wide with the kind of terror that makes grown men look like children. The Miller Ranch, 12 miles to the east, had been hit. The story spread through the dusty street faster than fire in dry grass. The barn was burned to the ground. The cattle had been driven off into the labyrinth of the canyons. And the worst of it, the part that made the men grip their Winchester rifles until their knuckles turned white, was that the Miller boy, barely 10 years old, was gone, taken. The mood in town shifted instantly from unease to a murderous, collective rage. The saloon, usually a place of lazy gambling and low talk, became a war room. Men stood in clusters, their voices rising in sharp bursts of anger. They spoke of extermination. They spoke of hunting down every Apache in the territory, regardless of band or treaty, and wiping them from the face of the earth. Maggie O'Connell heard the news while buying salt at the general store. She felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold despite the stifling heat of the afternoon. She stood by the counter, clutching her small parcel, while the storekeeper, Mr. Henderson, slammed a box of ammunition onto the counter for a customer. "It is time we stopped being gentle," Henderson growled. "The government is too soft. We need to clear them out like the vermin they are. If they want war, we will give them a war they will not survive." Maggie said nothing. She paid for her salt with trembling fingers and walked out into the blinding sunlight. Her stomach twisted into a hard, sick knot. She knew what this meant. It did not matter which band had raided the Miller Ranch. It did not matter if it was Geronimo or Victorio or a renegade group of young men acting alone. To the men of Red Rock, every Apache was guilty, and the man hiding in her cellar, the man whose blood she washed from her hands every night, would be lynched without a second thought if he were discovered. The following Sunday, the atmosphere in the small white church was poisonous. The air inside was hot and still, smelling of stale sweat, wool, and the dust that seeped through every crack in the walls. Reverend Silas stood at the pulpit, looking like an avenging angel carved from granite. He was a tall man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to see sin in every shadow. He did not speak of forgiveness that morning. He spoke of judgment. "The devil walks among us," Silas thundered, his voice echoing off the rough-hewn beams. "He does not always come with horns and a pitchfork. Sometimes he comes in the guise of mercy. Sometimes he works through weak hearts and unnatural lusts." Maggie sat in the back pew, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She kept her eyes fixed on the back of the woman's bonnet in front of her, but she could feel the weight of the sermon pressing down on her shoulders. Silas leaned over the pulpit, his gaze sweeping the congregation before landing, heavy and accusing, on Maggie. "Woe to the woman who lives alone, outside the proper protection of a father or a husband," he said, his voice dropping to a hiss that carried to every corner of the room. "Woe to the vessel that cracks, letting the darkness in. There are those who would shelter the heathen, thinking themselves charitable, when in truth they are inviting the serpent into the garden. Purity is our shield, and those who cast it aside are no better than the savages who steal our children." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Maggie felt the heat rising in her neck. She felt the heads turning, the sidelong glances from the women, the cold stares of the men. They did not know for certain, they could not know, but suspicion hung in the air like smoke. She was the outsider. She was the woman who lived too close to the wild, who knew the ways of healing that bordered on witchcraft in their eyes. When the service ended, Maggie tried to slip away quickly, but the crowd at the door was dense. She kept her head down, murmuring polite excuses, desperate to reach the open air. Just as she reached the bottom of the steps, a hand closed around her upper arm. She flinched, stopping abruptly. It was Elijah Carter. He stood close to her, blocking her path to the road. He was dressed in his Sunday best, a black suit that made his broad shoulders look even wider. But his face was hard. That was a powerful sermon, Elijah said quietly. Maggie looked at his hand on her arm. His fingers were digging into her flesh through the thin fabric of her dress. It did not feel like a caress. It felt like a shackle. It was very loud, Maggie said, keeping her voice even. If you will excuse me, Elijah, I have chores to attend to. Elijah did not let go. He stepped closer, invading her space until she could smell the tobacco on his breath. You are being foolish. Maggie, he said, do you think I do not hear the whispers? Do you think I do not see how they look at you? I cannot control what people think, she said. You could, Elijah countered. If you were my wife. Maggie looked up at him, meeting his gaze. His eyes were cold, calculating. He was not offering love. He was offering a bargain. If you stood by my side, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, no one would dare speak a word against you. I could put these rumors to rest. Whatever it is you are hiding, Maggie, and I know you are hiding something, I can make it go away. But you have to come to me, now, before it is too late. The threat was thinly veiled. Elijah suspected. Perhaps he had seen extra tracks near her cabin. Perhaps he had noticed her buying more food than a single woman needed. If she refused him, he would not protect her. He would feed her to the wolves. I have told you, Elijah, Maggie said, pulling her arm free with a sharp tug. I am not looking for a husband, and I have nothing to hide but my own grief. Good day. She turned and walked away, forcing herself not to run. Her back prickled, expecting a shout or a grab. But Elijah let her go. She could feel his anger radiating behind her, a silent promise that this was not over. When she reached the sanctuary of her cabin, Maggie bolted the door and leaned against it, shaking. She looked at the floorboards. She knew what she had to do. The risk had become too great. She had to tell Nantan to leave. He had to go, tonight, before the town's suspicion turned into a mob with torches. She waited until nightfall. The sun set in a blaze of blood-red light, and the wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the cabin. A dust storm was brewing. Maggie lit the lantern and went down to the cellar. Nantan was sitting up on the cot, whittling a piece of wood with a small, sharp stone he had found in the dirt floor. He looked up as she descended, his dark eyes alert. We have to talk, Maggie said. She set the lantern down. She meant to tell him to go. She meant to explain about the sermon, about Elijah, about the danger that was closing in on both of them. But then he moved to swing his legs off the cot. He winced, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. His injured leg trembled violently as he put weight on it. He reached out to steady himself against the wall, his knuckles turning white, sweat instantly beading on his forehead from the effort. Maggie watched him struggle. He was strong, yes, but the muscle was still healing. If he tried to walk the 10 miles to the foothills in this condition, without water, without a horse, he would collapse long before dawn. The desert would kill him as surely as the soldiers would. She looked at his face, the lines of pain around his mouth, the stubborn set of his jaw. I cannot do it, she thought. I cannot send him out to die. The words died in her throat. She sighed, a sound of defeat and resignation. Lie back down, she said softly. It is time for your treatment. Nantan looked at her, sensing the shift in her mood, the fear she carried from the world above. He did not ask questions. He simply nodded and lay back down. The wind outside grew louder, a mournful, shrieking sound as the sand began to scour the walls of the cabin. It was a sound that made the world feel small and isolated. Down in the cellar, with the storm raging above, they were the only two people in existence. Maggie poured the oil into her hands, warming it. The smell of arnica and sage filled the small space. She began to work on his leg, her fingers finding the familiar knots of tension. The atmosphere was different tonight. The threat from the town and the violence of the storm seemed to push them closer together. There was a desperate quality to the silence. Maggie worked her hands higher along his thigh, needing to loosen a deep knot near the hip that was causing his limp. Her fingers pressed deep into the muscle. Nantan gripped the edge of the cot. He threw his head back, fighting a groan that was not entirely born of pain. Maggie looked up. His eyes were open, fixed on her face. They were dark and unguarded, burning with a mixture of gratitude and a raw, naked hunger that stopped her breath. Her hands stilled on his skin. The heat from his body seemed to seep into her palms, traveling up her arms and settling in her chest. For a moment, the cellar vanished. The war vanished. The prejudices and the hatreds of the world above vanished. There was only the man and the woman, and the undeniable pull between them. Maggie felt a reckless heartbeat hammer against her ribs. She imagined, with vivid, terrifying clarity, what it would be like to lean forward, to close the few inches between them, to press her lips to his and taste the salt on his skin, to let go of the widow, the healer, the outcast, and just be Maggie. She leaned in, just a fraction. Nantan's hand moved, covering hers on his leg. His thumb swept across her knuckles, a rough, tender caress. Then the wind slammed a loose shutter against the cabin wall upstairs. Bang! The sound broke the spell like a gunshot. Maggie jerked back, snatching her hands away as if she had been burned. She stood up, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her face flushed hot with shame and confusion. I need to check the water barrel, she stammered, her voice thin and high. And the goats. I think I forgot to latch the pen. She began to tidy the bottles, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She talked to fill the silence, babbling about practical things, the price of grain, the likelihood of rain, the state of the garden. Nantan watched her. He did not move. He lay still, his chest rising and falling slowly. He understood what had happened. He understood the fear that had made her pull away. He looked at the ceiling, listening to her frantic words. Inside him, a storm was raging that matched the one outside. He felt a profound longing for her touch, for her softness. But with it came a crushing wave of guilt. He thought of Alope, his wife. He thought of her face in the firelight. To desire this white woman, this enemy, felt like a betrayal of his dead. And yet, he could not stop the feeling. It was there, alive and undeniable, growing in the dark, like a seed in winter. Finish the leg, he said quietly, cutting through her chatter. Please. Maggie stopped. She looked at him, seeing the conflict in his eyes that mirrored her own. She took a deep breath, steadied her hands, and returned to the cot. She finished the massage in silence, but the air between them vibrated with the words they did not say. The next morning, the wind had died, leaving the world coated in a fresh layer of red dust. Maggie woke early, her nerves jangling. She had slept poorly, her dreams filled with burning ranches and Elijah's cold eyes. She was in the kitchen, slicing bread, when she saw it through the window. 2 miles out, on the road from town, a cloud of dust was rising. It was moving fast. Maggie grabbed her spyglass from the mantelpiece, a relic from her husband's mining days. She focused it on the road. Her heart stopped. It was a squad of cavalry soldiers, and riding at the front, tracking the ground with the focus of a bloodhound, was a scout. He wore a mix of army blues and buckskins, his long hair braided, a mixed blood tracker. They were not just passing through. They were hunting. Maggie dropped the spyglass. She had minutes, maybe less. She ran to the cellar door, throwing it open. "Nantan," she hissed. "They are coming." He was already awake, sitting up, his knife in his hand. He heard the urgency in her voice. She scrambled down the ladder. "Soldiers," she said, breathless. "And a scout. They are tracking someone. They are coming here." Nantan stood up, ignoring the pain in his leg. He looked around the small cellar. There was nowhere to go. It was a trap. "Behind the barrels," Maggie said, pointing to the far corner where she kept large casks of vinegar and pickled cabbage. She helped him move. shoving the heavy wooden barrels aside to create a small, dark crevice against the earth wall. Nantan squeezed into the space, curling his large frame into a tight ball. He looked up at her, his face calm, prepared for death. Maggie grabbed a heavy canvas tarp she used for covering hay and draped it over the barrels, piling old sacks and a broken chair in front of it. It looked like a pile of junk, accumulated over years of neglect. "Don't move," she whispered. "Do not breathe." She ran back up the ladder, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She smoothed her hair, grabbed a bowl of peas, and sat down at her kitchen table, forcing her hands to start shelling them. 2 minutes later, the heavy thud of boots sounded on her porch. The door shook under a heavy fist. "Open up. In the name of the United States Army." Maggie took a deep breath. She stood up and opened the door. Standing there was a captain she had not seen before. He was a hard-eyed man with a gray mustache and a scar running through his eyebrow. He was covered in dust, and he looked angry. Behind him stood the scout, who was studying the ground around Maggie's porch with intense interest. "Good morning, Captain," Maggie said. Her voice was steady, but her knees felt like water. "To what do I owe this visit?" Captain Rowe pushed past her without an invitation. Stepping into the kitchen, his spurs jingled on the floor. He looked around the room, his eyes taking in the stove, the bed in the corner, the table with the peas. "We are tracking a wounded hostile," Rowe said, his voice grating. "The scout picked up a trail 3 miles back. It heads this direction. I have seen no one." "Captain," Maggie said. Rowe turned to her. He stepped close, looking her up and down. He grabbed her hand, lifting it roughly. Maggie flinched, but she did not pull away. "Your hands are damp," Rowe said, "and they smell." "What is that? Arnica?" Maggie's mind raced. "I am a healer, Captain. She said, I was grinding herbs this morning for a salve. Mrs. Miller has rheumatism. I was preparing it for her." Rowe stared at her, his eyes narrowing. He sniffed her hand again. Then he dropped it. He walked to the center of the room. He stomped his boot on the floorboards. The sound echoed hollowly. "What is down there?" he asked. "A root cellar," Maggie said. "Potatoes, preserves. Show me." Maggie walked to the trap door. She pulled it open. The smell of damp earth drifted up. Rowe leaned over, peering into the gloom. He put his hand on his revolver. The scout stepped forward. "Captain," he said, "the tracks. They go round the back, toward the creek." Rowe paused. He looked at the cellar, then at the scout. He spat on the floor. "Fine," he muttered. He straightened up and looked at Maggie one last time. Suspicion flared in his eyes. He did not believe her. Not fully. "If I find out you are lying to me—" "Woman," Rowe said softly, "I will see you hang. I do not care if you are white, black, or purple. A traitor is a traitor." He turned and marched out. "Mount up," he shouted to his men. Maggie stood in the doorway, watching them ride away toward the creek. She watched until they were out of sight. Then she collapsed. She sank to the floor, burying her face in her hands, shaking uncontrollably. It was over. But it wasn't over. They would realize the tracks at the creek led nowhere. They would come back, or Elijah would come, or the preacher. The clock was ticking. She dragged herself to the cellar door and climbed down. Nantan was already pushing the barrels aside. He crawled out, his face pale, sweat soaking his shirt. He was in agony from the cramped position. "We have to leave," Maggie whispered. Nantan looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes. "No," he said, "I leave. You stay." "You are safe if I am gone." "No!" Maggie cried. Her voice rose, cracking with hysteria. "Did you not hear him? He suspects. He knows. If they find tracks leaving here, they will know I hid you. They will hang me." "Nantan!" She grabbed his arm. "We cannot stay here. Neither of us." Nantan pulled away, angry. "I cannot walk," he snapped. "I am burden. I will slow you. They catch us both. I don't care," Maggie shouted. She was crying now, the tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "I don't care. I will not die in a hole." Nantan shouted back. His voice boomed in the small space. "If I die as warrior, under sky, not hiding behind woman's skirt. You think you are the only one with pride?" Maggie yelled, shoving him in the chest. "You think this land has been kind to me? You think because I am white, I am safe? I am nothing to them. I am a widow without money. I am expendable, just like you." They stood chest to chest, breathing hard, the anger and the fear boiling over. The cultural divide, the history of violence, the sheer impossibility of their situation. It all exploded in the small, dim room. Suddenly, Nantan doubled over. A spasm of cramping muscle seized his injured leg. Locking it tight, he gasped, falling forward. Maggie moved without thinking. She caught him. She took his weight, her arms wrapping around his waist. He grabbed her shoulders to keep from falling. They collided awkwardly, their bodies pressing together from chest to thigh. Maggie dug her fingers into his back, holding him up. Nantan's breath came hot and fast against her hair. The smell of him, sweat, sage, and danger, filled her senses. The anger drained away in an instant, replaced by something hotter, sharper. They froze. The argument died on their lips. Nantan looked down at her. Maggie looked up. Their faces were inches apart. The fear of death, the adrenaline of the search, the weeks of suppressed longing. It all fused into a single, blinding moment of clarity. They were not enemies. They were two people clinging to each other on the edge of a cliff. Nantan's hand moved from her shoulder to the back of her neck. His fingers tangled in her hair. His gaze dropped to her mouth. Maggie felt a jolt of desire so strong it made her knees weak. She wanted him to kiss her. She wanted him to prove that they were still alive, but she pulled back. She pushed against his chest, gently but firmly. She stepped out of his embrace, her breath ragged. "We have to go," she said, her voice shaking. "If we stay here, we die, both of us." Nantan stared at her, his chest heaving. He nodded slowly. "Where?" "Your people," Maggie said. "The mountains. It is the only place the patrols cannot easily reach. It is far," Nantan said. "Hard journey." "I know," Maggie said. She wiped her eyes. "I will pack the mule." They moved with the desperate efficiency of fugitives. Maggie went upstairs and packed a canvas sack. She put in dried meat, a bag of cornmeal, her medical kit, a canteen, and a box of matches. She took her husband's heavy coat and her Winchester rifle. She looked around the cabin one last time. This was her home. It was a poor, hard place. But it was hers. The garden she had watered, the stove she had kept lit, the bed where she had slept alone for so many years. She was leaving it all. She was walking away from her life, her race, and her safety. She went to the table and tore a piece of brown paper from a sugar sack. She took a piece of charcoal from the stove. She wrote a single sentence, her hand steady now. "Gone to find a place where no one owns my life." She left the note on the center of the table, weighted down by the salt cellar. When she went outside, the night was dark and cold. Nantan was waiting by the corral, leaning on a fence post. He had saddled her old mule, Bess. Maggie helped him mount. He hissed in pain but settled into the saddle. He reached down and offered her his hand. Maggie took it. He pulled her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his back. They rode out of the yard, leaving the cabin silent and empty behind them. They did not look back toward the town. They turned their faces toward the mountains, toward the unknown, and toward a future that promised nothing but hardship and each other. The moon hung high above the Arizona desert, a cold, silver coin that washed the landscape in a ghostly light. It offered enough illumination to travel by, but it also stripped the world of its color, turning the red rocks to gray and the green scrub to black. Maggie walked at the head of the mule, the leather-led rope wrapped around her gloved hand, her boots crunching softly on the gravel of the dry wash. Behind her, the mule, a stubborn creature named Bess, plodded along with her head down, carrying the weight of the wounded warrior. Nantan rode in silence, his body swaying with the animal's gait. He gripped the pommel of the saddle with white-knuckled intensity, his injured leg stiff and throbbing, but he made no sound. They were ghosts moving through a graveyard of stone. To the north lay the town of Red Rock, with its church and its saloon and its righteous anger. To the south lay the Dragon Mountains, a fortress of granite and shadow where Nantan's people hid from the cavalry. Between the 2 points lay 50 miles of the most unforgiving terrain on God's earth. The first night was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every shadow that stretched across the sand looked like a soldier. Every snap of a twig sounded like a rifle cocking. Maggie kept a punishing pace, driven by the knowledge that Captain Rowe would not give up the hunt easily. She led them through a maze of arroyos and game trails, paths that Nantan whispered down to her from the saddle, his voice tight with pain. "Turn left at the split rock," he would say. "Follow the dry water." By dawn, they were miles from the cabin. Deep in the Badlands where the earth was broken and twisted, they found a shallow overhang beneath a limestone rim, hidden by a screen of mesquite and catclaw acacia. Maggie helped Nantan down from the mule. He collapsed onto the bedroll she spread out, his face gray, sweat soaking his shirt despite the morning chill. The days were an oven. The sun hammered against the rocks until the air shimmered and danced. They lay in the shade of the overhang, sipping sparingly from their canteens. Speaking little, they were two fugitives sharing the silence of the hunted. Maggie watched the horizon for dust clouds, her hand never straying far from the stock of her husband's Winchester. When night fell, they moved again. The journey became a brutal rhythm of endurance. Maggie's boots, old and worn, began to rub raw spots on her heels. Blisters formed, burst, and bled, sticking to her socks. Her skirts were torn by thorns, the hem heavy with dust, but she did not complain. She looked at Nantan, who rode with a grim determination, fighting a fever that rose and fell with the sun, and she found the strength to keep walking. On the third night, the weather turned against them. They were navigating a narrow slot canyon, a winding slit in the earth with walls that rose 200 feet on either side. The sky above was a ribbon of stars, but to the west, heavy clouds had blotted out the moon. The air grew heavy and still. Then, the wind changed. It brought a smell that Maggie knew well from her years on the frontier, the smell of wet dust and ozone. "Rain," she said, pausing. Nantan looked up, his eyes scanning the rim of the canyon high above. "Not here," he said. Mountains, storms in the high country could drop inches of rain in an hour, sending water rushing miles downstream into the dry lowlands. The slot canyon was a funnel. "We need to get to high ground," Maggie said, urgency sharpening her voice. She pulled on the mule's lead, urging Bess forward. The canyon floor was deep sand, making the going slow. They hurried, stumbling in the dark, looking for a way up the sheer walls. A low rumble began to vibrate through the soles of Maggie's boots. It sounded like a freight train approaching from deep underground. "Run!" Nantan shouted. Maggie slapped the mule's flank. The animal spooked, jerking the rope, but Maggie held on. Ahead, she saw a break in the canyon wall, a steep slope of scree and boulders leading up to a ledge. "Up!" she screamed. She scrambled up the slope, dragging the mule behind her. The rocks shifted under her feet, sliding and clattering. Nantan kicked his good leg free of the stirrup, ready to jump if the mule went down. The roar grew deafening. It was a physical force, shaking the air. Maggie reached the ledge, gasping for breath, and pulled Bess up after her. The mule scrambled, hooves striking sparks against the stone, and hauled herself onto the flat rock. But the slope was treacherous. As the mule lunged up, the lead rope went slack, and Maggie lost her balance. Her foot slipped on a loose rock. She fell backward, sliding down the scree toward the canyon floor. "Maggie!" The shout was swallowed by the thunder of the water. Maggie clawed at the ground, tearing her fingernails, but she was sliding fast. Then a hand clamped around her forearm. Nantan had thrown himself from the saddle. He lay flat on the ledge, reaching down, his face twisted in a rictus of agony. He had anchored himself with his bad leg, the muscle she had tended so carefully taking his full weight in hers. He roared with the effort, his grip like iron. He hauled her up, inch by agonizing inch, until she could grab a root and pull herself onto the ledge. They collapsed together on the stone just as the water hit. It was a wall of black churn, 10 feet high, carrying logs and boulders as if they were twigs. It slammed through the canyon with a violence that made the earth tremble. Where Maggie had been standing seconds before was now a boiling torrent of death. They lay panting in the darkness, the spray from the flood misting their faces. Maggie turned to Nantan. He was curled on his side, clutching his injured thigh, his teeth gritted so hard she thought they might shatter. "You jumped," she whispered, horrified. "Your leg." He looked at her, his eyes dark and wild in the gloom. The pain was blinding him, but he saw her. He saw that she was alive. "Better leg than you," he gritted out. Maggie crawled to him. She did not care about the rain or the flood or the danger. She laid her hands on his face, feeling the cold sweat. "You fool," she said, her voice breaking. "You stubborn fool." "I am warrior," he whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Not sack of potatoes." The moment bound them. It was a tie stronger than the rope she used to lead the mule. He had traded his pain for her life. In the roar of the flood, the last remnants of the line between them washed away. The storm passed, leaving the air scrubbed clean and smelling of wet sage. They stayed on the ledge until dawn, waiting for the water to recede. The next few nights, the ritual changed. They could no longer risk a fire every night. But Nantan's leg demanded attention. The strain of the rescue had set his recovery back. The muscle was tight and angry. Under the vast canopy of the Milky Way, Maggie would lay out the blanket. Nantan would lie down, and she would work on him in the dark. There were no walls to contain them now. The cellar was gone. The desert was their room. The wind wrapped around them, cold and lonely. But her hands were warm. She worked the tension from his hip, from his thigh, from his calf. The intimacy of it deepened. In the cellar, it had been a medical necessity performed in secret. Here, under the open sky, it felt like an act of devotion. Nantan no longer stiffened at her touch. He welcomed it. He learned the weight of her hands. He learned the rhythm of her breathing. One night, they climbed higher into the foothills of the Dragon Mountains. The air grew thin and sharp. Frost began to form on the stiff grass. They made camp in a grove of stunted pine trees, sheltered from the wind but exposed to the biting cold. They had only 2 thin blankets. "It is freezing," Maggie said, her teeth chattering as she tried to wrap her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Nantan looked at her from where he sat against a tree. He looked at the single bedroll. "We share," he said, "for warmth, no other way." Maggie looked at the bedroll. She knew he was right. Survival came first. She lay down, and he lay down beside her. They covered themselves with the blankets. It was awkward at first. They lay back to back, stiff and careful not to touch more than necessary. But the cold was relentless. Slowly, instinct took over. They shifted, turning toward the center. Nantan's back pressed against Maggie's chest. Then, they turned again. Eventually, they settled. Maggie lay on her side, and Nantan lay behind her, his body curving around hers to shield her from the wind. His arm draped over her waist, heavy and protective. Maggie lay awake, staring at the pine needles, her heart beating slow and hard. She could feel the heat of him through their clothes. She could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest against her back. It was the first time in 4 years she had been held, even if it was for survival. The sensation of being held brought a lump to her throat. Nantan was awake too. He was hyper-aware of every point of contact. The softness of her, the smell of her hair, which was no longer soap but dust and pine smoke. It made his head spin. To distract themselves, they talked. The darkness made it easier to speak of things that withered in the light. Nantan spoke first. His voice was a low rumble against her ear. "First time I kill soldier," he said quietly. "I was 16. He was young, maybe 18. He had blue eyes. I shoot him in chest. I think I will feel big, strong, like stories." He paused. I feel nothing. He said, just empty. Like wind blow through me. I look at him and think, his mother waits for him, just like my mother waits. It made me sick, but I yell war cry. I act proud, because that is what men do. Maggie listened, her hand resting on his arm where it lay across her waist. I saw a boy die once, she whispered. In town. A Mexican boy. Someone said he stole a horse. There was no proof. The men, they dragged him out of the jail. The sheriff did nothing. They hanged him from the cottonwood tree by the river. She shuddered, the memory cold as the frost. The town cheered. She said, I saw women I knew, women I went to church with, clapping. I stood there and I watched. I did nothing. I was so afraid, and I was so ashamed. I went home and scrubbed my floor until my hands bled, but I could not get the feeling of being dirty off of me. Cruelty is everywhere, Nantan said. My people too. We burn. We torture. We say it is for revenge, but blood is just blood. It stains everyone the same. We are both lost. Then, Maggie said softly. No, Nantan said. He tightened his arm around her slightly. Not lost, just awake. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint, dying glow. Maggie turned in the blankets so she was facing him. They were close. So close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Her hand moved, almost of its own accord. She placed her palm on his chest, over his heart. She could feel it beating, strong, steady, a drum in the silence of the mountains. He covered her hand with his own. His fingers were rough, calloused from the bow and the rain, but his touch was gentle. He did not move her hand away. He pressed it closer to him. Maggie, he whispered. Yes, every night you touch my leg, he said, his voice straining with emotion. You fix muscle, you fix skin, but you touch here too. He pressed her hand harder against his heart. I thought this part was dead. He said, buried with elope, buried with my brother. I thought I was just weapon. Nothing else, but you touch me. And it hurts. It hurts because it is coming alive again. Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. She looked at this man, this warrior who had been a terrifying stranger in her wash just weeks ago. She saw the boy who had felt empty after his first kill. She saw the husband who had grieved. She saw the man who had carried her up a cliff face while his own body screamed in agony. The fear that had ruled her life, the fear of the town, of the preacher, of Elijah, of being alone, suddenly seemed very small and far away. Nantan. She breathed. She moved her hand from his chest to his cheek, cupping his face. His skin was rough with stubble, warm against her palm. She leaned forward. He did not pull away. He leaned to meet her. Their lips met under the cold, bright stars. It was hesitant at first, a question asked in the dark. Is this real? Are we allowed this? Then the answer came. Nantan groaned low in his throat, and his hand came up to tangle in her hair. He pulled her closer. The kiss deepened, breaking open the dam of grief and loneliness that had held them both back for so long. It was a desperate, hungry thing. It tasted of salt and smoke and longing. Maggie clung to him, her fingers gripping his shoulders, feeling the solid reality of him. She felt alive. For the first time since Samuel died. For the first time since she had become the widow O'Connell. She was just a woman. She was desired. She was seen. Nantan kissed her as if he were drowning and she was air. The rage that had fueled him for years melted away, replaced by a terrifying tenderness. He wanted to consume her. He wanted to protect her. They broke apart, gasping for air, their foreheads resting against each other. They were both shaking. Maggie pulled back slightly, her eyes wide. The reality of what they had done crashed down on her. Nantan, she whispered. I am terrified. Of me? He asked, searching her face. No, she said, never of you. But do you know what this means? The world will hate us. My people will hang me. Your people will despise you. We will be outcasts. Everywhere. Nantan looked at her. He reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. The world has taken everything from me. Maggie, he said, it took my land. It took my family. It took my peace. It gave me nothing but loss. He held her gaze, his expression fierce and solemn. If loving you is a risk, he said, then it is the first risk I take for myself. Not for war, not for hate, for me. I will take it. Maggie looked at him, and the fear settled into a quiet resolve. She nodded. Then I will take it too. They slept in each other's arms that night, not for survival, but for comfort. The next day, they reached the timberline. The landscape changed from high desert scrub to thick forests of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. The air was thin and smelled of resin. Nantan became more alert. He sat straighter in the saddle, his eyes scanning the trees. He made bird calls, soft whistles that sounded like a jay. Then a hawk, finally. A whistle answered him. We are here, he said. They rode into a clearing that seemed empty, but Maggie felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Suddenly, the forest came alive. Men stepped out from behind the trees. They were like spirits, appearing from nowhere. There were a dozen of them, Apache warriors with painted faces and hard eyes. They held bows with strings drawn taut. Some held rifles leveled at Maggie's chest. Maggie froze. She felt the weight of their hostility. To them, she was not Maggie the healer. She was a white woman. She was the face of the enemy that had hunted them, starved them, and killed their families. Nantan raised his hand. Palm out. Du Hande, he shouted. Enju! A man stepped forward. He was short and broad, with a scar running down his chin and eyes that burned with a fierce intelligence. This was Taklish, Nantan's cousin. He looked at Nantan, and relief washed over his face. But then he looked at Maggie, and the relief turned to cold fury. He spat a rapid stream of Apache at Nantan, pointing an accusing finger at Maggie. Maggie did not need to speak the language to understand the tone. Traitor, enemy, spy. Nantan slid down from the mule. He stood on his bad leg, wincing but holding his ground. He spoke back, his voice calm but forceful. He pointed to his leg, then to Maggie. He mimed the motion of healing. Taklish shook his head, shouting. He stepped closer to Maggie, his hand on his knife. Bess, the mule, pinned her ears back. Maggie sat straight in the saddle. She would not show fear. She looked Taklish in the eye. Nantan stepped between them. He placed his hand on Taklish's chest, pushing him back. She is with me? Nantan said in English, so Maggie could understand. She saved my life. When my own people were not there, she was there. Taklish glared at him. She is white. She brings soldiers. Soldiers were already coming. Nantan said, she left her home. She left her people. To save me. She is under my protection. The warriors murmured. The idea of a white woman saving a warrior was strange, almost unbelievable. But Nantan was a respected fighter. His word meant something. Taklish spat on the ground near the mule's hooves. The old one will decide, he growled. They led them deeper into the forest, to a hidden valley where the camp was spread out along a creek. It was a temporary place, ready to be packed up in an hour. Wickiups made of brush and canvas stood in a circle. As they rode in, silence fell over the camp. Women stopped grinding corn. Children stopped playing. Elders looked up from their fires, hundreds of eyes fixed on Maggie. She felt naked, exposed. She felt the hatred rolling off them in waves. She saw a woman look at her with pure venom, likely thinking of a husband or son killed by white soldiers. They stopped before a central fire. An old man sat on a buffalo robe. His face was a map of wrinkles, his hair white as snow, but his back was straight. This was Dasoda, the leader of this band. Nantan spoke to him for a long time. He told the story of the wash, the cellar, the massage, the flood. Dasoda listened, his face unreadable. He looked at Maggie. He looked at her hands, resting on the saddle horn. Finally, the old man spoke. His voice was like dry leaves rustling. She stays, he said in English, his accent thick. For now. But if she is spy, if she makes signal, she dies. He looked at Nantan. You are responsible. Her blood is on your hands if she is enemy. Your blood is on her hands if she is friend. Nantan nodded. It is done. He helped Maggie down. She stood close to him, her shoulder brushing his arm. She was safe, for the moment. But as she looked around the circle of faces, she realized she had traded one prison for another. She was alive, but she was watching her back. Yet, as she walked toward the wickiup Nantan pointed to, she saw a young girl watching her. The girl did not look hateful. She looked curious. And in the shadows of a tent, she saw a mother rocking a baby, singing a soft song that sounded just like the lullabies Maggie's own mother had sung. It was a community. It was a place of fear, yes, but also of life. And for the first time in a long time, Maggie was not alone. She had Nantan, and he had her. The camp lay hidden in a high, cradle-like valley of the Dragon Mountains, a place where the air was thin and smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. To Maggie O'Connell, who had spent her life on the flat, sun-baked floor of the desert, this world felt like a different planet. Here, the wind did not scour. It whispered through the needles of the ponderosa pines. The water in the creek did not taste of alkali. It was cold and sweet. Born of snowmelt from peaks that touched the clouds, life here possessed a rhythm that was ancient and hard, yet strangely peaceful compared to the anxious, clock-watching existence of the town. There were no church bells here to mark the hours, only the position of the sun. There were no fences to mend, only the endless, rocky slopes to watch. Maggie sat on a buffalo robe outside the wickiup she shared with Nantan, shelling acorns that the women had gathered from the scrub oaks lower down the mountain. She watched the camp with the eyes of a woman trying to learn a new language without a book. She saw children playing in the dust, their laughter bright and sharp as glass. They played games of hunting and hiding, the boys stalking each other with small bows made of juniper, the girls building miniature wickiups of twigs. They looked happy, but Maggie noticed how thin their limbs were. She saw the way their eyes tracked the adults, always reading the tension in the air. She saw women grinding corn on flat stones, the rhythmic shh sound forming the heartbeat of the afternoon. They worked with efficient, callus-hardened hands, wasting nothing. They dried meat in thin strips, tanned hides with brains and grease, and mended moccasins with sinew thread. They were strong, these women, with faces weathered by the same sun that had aged Maggie, but there was a hardness in them that she found intimidating. They looked at her not with curiosity, but with a guarded, cold assessment. She was a mouth to feed in a time of scarcity. She was a white face in a place where white faces usually meant death. The elders sat in the shade of the pinon trees, smoking pipes and speaking in low, gravelly tones. They were the memory of the people, the ones who remembered the days before the reservations and the soldiers. They watched Maggie too, their dark eyes unreadable. But amidst the peace, there was a pervasive, gnawing hunger. The game was scarce this year. The soldiers had frightened the herds of deer and elk, driving them deeper into the wilderness. The rations the government had promised at the agency were a lie, which was why this band had fled in the first place. Maggie saw the way mothers gave the largest portions of the evening stew to their children and husbands, eating only the broth themselves. She saw the way Nantan tightened his belt, his cheekbones growing sharper with every passing week. Despite the hardship, Maggie felt a strange sense of belonging, or perhaps just a shared struggle. She was no longer the widow O'Connell, the object of pity and gossip. She was simply a woman trying to survive. One afternoon, a hush fell over the southern edge of the camp. A young woman named Ileana was weeping softly outside her wickiup. Her son, a boy of 5 winters named Chayton, had fallen ill. Maggie had seen the boy earlier that day, his face flushed, his eyes glassy. Now, as the sun dipped toward the western peaks, the heat coming off his small body was frightening. The band's healer was an old woman, bent with arthritis, who was currently bedridden with a sickness of her own. The women whispered among themselves, helpless. They had sung the songs, they had burned the sage, but the fever burned on. Maggie stood up, wiping her hands on her skirt. She hesitated. To interfere could be seen as an insult. To fail would be unforgivable. But she remembered Samuel. She remembered the helplessness of watching her own son burn while the doctor sat in town, drinking whiskey. She could not watch it happen again. She walked to Nantan, who was fletching arrows by the fire. "The boy," she said quietly. "He is burning up." Nantan looked at her, then at the weeping mother. "The old one is sick. He said, 'There is no one to break the heat. Let me try.'" Maggie said. Nantan studied her face. He saw the fear there, but also the stubbornness he had come to love. "If you fail," he warned, his voice low, "they will say you cursed him. And if I do nothing, he might die," Maggie countered. Nantan nodded. He stood and walked with her to Ileana's wickiup. He spoke to the mother in Apache, his voice gentle. Ileana looked at Maggie with wide, frightened eyes. She pulled the boy closer for a moment. Then, seeing the flushed agony on his face, she relented. She nodded, moving aside. Maggie entered the dim shelter. The air was thick with smoke and sickness. She knelt beside the boy. His skin was dry and hot as a sun-baked stone. "I need willow bark," she told Nantan, "and the root of the osha plant if you have it, and cool water, not cold, but cool, for the next 6 hours." Maggie worked. She brewed a bitter tea from the willow bark, forcing small spoonfuls between the boy's parched lips. She soaked cloths in the cool water and bathed his forehead, his neck, his wrists. She murmured soft words in English, nonsense words of comfort that the boy could not understand but seemed to feel. The mother watched from the corner, her hands twisted in her skirt. Nantan sat by the door, a silent sentry. The night wore on. The camp grew quiet, save for the hoot of an owl. Maggie's back ached, and her own throat was dry, but she did not stop. She bathed him, fanned him, coaxed the tea into him, just before dawn. The boy shivered. Maggie put her hand on his forehead. It was wet. The dry, baking heat had broken into a sweat. "He is cooling," she whispered. Ileana rushed forward, falling to her knees. She touched her son's face, then looked at Maggie. There were no words in the shared glance, only the universal language of mothers who have peered into the abyss and been pulled back. Ileana took Maggie's hand and pressed it to her forehead. When Maggie emerged from the wickiup, the sun was painting the sky in strokes of violent orange and purple. She was exhausted, but she felt a lightness she had not felt since arriving. As she walked to the creek to wash, she noticed a change. The women did not look away. One nodded. Another offered her a small cake of cornbread. The glass wall had cracked. She was not yet one of them, but she was no longer just a ghost. Nantan was waiting for her by the water. He handed her a canteen. "You did good." He said, "I just did what I know," she replied, splashing water on her face. He watched the water drip from her chin. "You are strong. Maggie, stronger than the rock." For Nantan, life in the camp was a constant, grinding test of loyalty. He was a Chiricahua warrior, bound by blood and honor to his people. He knew every story of betrayal, every massacre, every broken treaty. He saw the scars on his cousin Taklish's back from a whipping post at the agency. He saw the grief in DeSoto's eyes for a land that was shrinking every day. But he also loved the woman who slept beside him. He spent his days training the younger boys. He taught them how to move through the brush without snapping a twig, how to hold a bow so the string did not slap the wrist, how to listen to the warnings of the jay and the squirrel. He was hard on them because he knew the world they were growing into would show them no mercy. But at night, the warrior laid down his weapons. They had built a small lean-to a little ways apart from the main circle, allowed a degree of privacy due to Maggie's status as an outsider. There, by a small, smokeless fire, the tension of the day would bleed away. Nantan's leg was strong now. The muscle had healed long and supple thanks to Maggie's hands. He could run, he could climb, though a deep ache still settled in the bone when the storms rolled in. One night, the moon was hidden by clouds, and the darkness was absolute. Maggie sat cross-legged, massaging Nantan's calf. It was no longer a medical necessity, and they both knew it. It was a language. Her thumbs worked the muscle, slow and deep. Nantan lay back, his eyes closed, his breathing matching the rhythm of her hands. "Do you think there is a place," Maggie asked softly, "where there are no flags? No American flag, no Mexican flag, just Earth?" Nantan opened one eye. "The Earth does not know flags," he said. "Only men know flags. I dream of a house," she continued, her hands moving up to his knee. "Not a cabin, a house with stone walls, thick ones, walls that keep out the wind and the hate. I would plant a garden that does not die, and there would be apple trees. Apple trees take years to grow." Nantan said, "I have time," Maggie said. She moved her hand higher, her fingers trailing along his thigh. The atmosphere in the lean-to shifted, becoming heavy and charged. Nantan reached out and took her hand. He pulled her gently until she was leaning over him. "Maybe," he whispered, his voice rough, "there will be children. Children who know the mountains and the words of your people. Children who are both—" Maggie's breath hitched. To speak of children was a dangerous hope. It was a defiance of the reality that hunted them. "I would like that," she whispered. He reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered on her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. For a moment, they just looked at each other, stripping away the layers of war and widowhood. Desire, hot and sharp, flashed through them. Nantan began to pull her down for a kiss, his hand tightening on her neck. Then, a dog barked in the main camp. A voice called out a challenge to the perimeter guard. They froze. The reality of their position crashed back in. They were not alone. They were watched. There were men in this camp who still spat when Maggie walked by. There were whispers that Nantan had been bewitched, that he had forgotten the blood of his brother for the touch of a white woman. Nantan released her slowly. Frustration etched on his face. He sat up, checking the knife at his belt. "Not yet," he muttered. "Not yet." The fragile peace shattered 2 days later. Taklish, who had been scouting the lower valley to the east, rode into camp at a gallop. His horse was lathered, its sides heaving. He slid from the saddle before the animal had even stopped moving. "Bluecoats." Taklish spat, his eyes wide with adrenaline. Nantan and DeSoto met him by the fire. Maggie stood in the doorway of their shelter, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Where?" Nantan asked. "Shadow Canyon. 10 miles. They're camped. How many? 20, maybe 30, and they have a scout who knows the way." Taklish looked at Maggie, his gaze venomous. He pointed a shaking finger at her. "They know," Taklish snarled. "I heard them talking. They say the captain, Rowe. He knows the white woman is here. The rancher, Carter, told him. They say she is a traitor. They say they will hang her and burn us out." A murmur of anger rippled through the warriors gathering around. Hands went to knives. Eyes turned to Maggie, hard and accusing. Nantan stepped in front of Taklish. "Did they see you?" Nantan asked. "No," Taklish said. "But they are coming. They follow the tracks of the mule." DeSoto raised his hand for silence. "We cannot run with the old ones and the babies," he said. "Not if they are that close. We must fight, or we must talk." "Talk?" Taklish laughed bitterly. "When have they ever talked without lying?" "If we fight," DeSoto said, "we lose men, we lose time. Perhaps if we give them what they want." His eyes flickered to Maggie. Nantan stiffened. "No," he said firmly. "We will parley." DeSoto decided. "We will see if they will turn back. If not, then we fight." An hour later, a group of 6 warriors, led by Nantan and Taklish, rode down to the entrance of the valley. Maggie insisted on coming. Nantan tried to stop her, but she grabbed the bridle of his horse. "If they want me," she said, "I have to be there. If I can stop them from attacking, I will." They found the patrol in a narrow box canyon. Captain Rowe sat on his horse, flanked by his men. Elijah Carter was there too, dressed in a long duster, a shotgun resting on his saddle. When they saw the Apaches, the soldiers raised their carbines. "Hold fire!" Rowe shouted. The 2 groups stopped 50 yards apart. The tension was a physical thing, a tight wire ready to snap. Maggie rode Bess forward, flanking Nantan. She saw Elijah's eyes widen. "Maggie!" Elijah shouted. "Thank God! Are you hurt? Did they force you? I am here of my own will." "Elijah!" Maggie called back, her voice ringing off the canyon walls. "Go back! Leave these people alone!" Roe spat. "She is brain-addled," he said to Elijah. "Or she is a whore. Either way, she comes with us. Give us the woman," Roe shouted to the Apaches. "And we will leave you be for today." Nantan looked at Roe. He looked at Maggie. "She is not yours to take," Nantan shouted. Suddenly, a young warrior behind Taklish, a boy of no more than 17 whose father had been hanged at Fort Grant, saw a soldier shift his rifle. The boy panicked. He remembered the stories. He thought they were about to be slaughtered. He let an arrow fly. It was a clumsy shot. It struck a soldier in the shoulder, sticking in the heavy wool of his coat. The soldier screamed, "Fire!" Roe roared. The canyon exploded. It was chaos. Smoke filled the air instantly. Horses screamed and reared. Bullets whined off the rocks like angry hornets. Nantan grabbed Maggie's reins. "Ride!" he shouted. "Back to the rocks!" He slapped Bess on the rump. The mule bolted, but Maggie did not ride away. She slid from the saddle as the skirmish turned into a brawl. She saw a warrior fall, clutching his stomach. She ran to him, dragging him behind a boulder while bullets chipped the stone above her head. She pressed her hands to the wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood. She was not thinking of sides. She was not thinking of politics. She was thinking of the red blood that looked exactly the same as the blood of the miners she had treated. The fight was brief but brutal. The Apaches, knowing the terrain, rained arrows and fire from the rocks. The soldiers, caught in the open, fell back. "Retreat!" Roe shouted, "Fall back!" The cavalry turned and galloped out of the canyon, leaving 2 of their own dead in the dust. Elijah cast one last, hateful look at the rocks before spurring his horse away. The Apaches did not chase them. They had their own wounded to tend to. They returned to the camp in a somber procession. Maggie walked beside the horse carrying the wounded warrior, keeping pressure on his stomach. But as they entered the circle of wickiups, a sound rose up that stopped Maggie's heart. It was a high, keening wail, a mother's sound. During the confusion, a stray bullet from the soldiers' long-range rifles had arced over the ridge and into the camp. It had struck a child. Maggie pushed through the crowd. She saw Ileana rocking back and forth in the dust. In her arms was Chayton, the boy Maggie had healed of fever just days before. His chest was shattered. He was gone. Maggie stopped. Her hands, covered in the blood of the warrior she had saved, fell to her sides. The irony was a knife in her gut. She had saved him from the fire of fever only for him to be consumed by the fire of men. Taklish stood over the body. He looked at the dead boy. Then he turned slowly to look at Maggie. His face was a mask of grief that twisted instantly into blind rage. "You!" he screamed. He pointed at her, his hand trembling. "You brought them! You brought the blue coats! You brought the death!" The camp was silent. The wailing of the mother was the only sound. Then a low murmur began. It started with the women. Then the men joined in. It was a sound of agreement, a sound of blame. "You are cursed," Taklish shouted, stepping toward her, his hand going to his knife. "You are white poison." He lunged. Maggie did not move. She felt hollowed out. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was poison. But a shape moved in a blur. Nantan stepped between them. He caught Taklish's wrist in midair. "Enough!" Nantan roared. He shoved his cousin back. Taklish stumbled, looking at Nantan with betrayal in his eyes. "Step aside, Nantan!" Taklish hissed. "She killed him, just as surely as if she pulled the trigger." "She healed him," Nantan shouted back. "She saved him from the sickness. The bullet came from a soldier's gun." "Because the soldier was looking for her." Taklish screamed. The crowd was closing in. The anger was palpable. They needed someone to hate. They needed a place to put their grief. Maggie stepped out from behind Nantan. "Stop," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. She looked at the old leader. "Dasoda." She looked at Ileana, still rocking her dead son. "He is right. Maggie said, tears streaming down her dusty face. If I were not here, maybe Roe would not have come so hard. Maybe he would not have brought the rancher. She looked at Nantan. I will not let this happen again. I will go. I will surrender to them. Or I will leave. But I will not stay here and be the death of you. DeSoto watched her. He saw the resignation in her eyes. He saw a woman who was willing to die to spare a people who hated her. Nantan turned on her, gripping her shoulders. No, he said fiercely. You think if you leave, they stop. You think Roe goes home? He wants land. He wants glory. He hunts us because we are Apache. Not because of you. You are just the excuse. He turned to the crowd. Look at her, Nantan shouted. She carries our wounded. She heals our sick. She fights beside us. The enemy is out there, not here. If we turn on each other, we are already dead. The argument hung in the air. Tacklish glared, breathing hard. But he sheathed his knife. The logic held barely, but the resentment did not vanish. It merely simmered, waiting. That night, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke over the mountains. Thunder shook the ground, and rain lashed against the canvas of their shelter. Inside, the mood was as heavy as the air outside. Maggie sat on the blankets, staring at the small fire. Nantan sat opposite her, cleaning his rifle. I cannot stay. Nantan, she said softly. You saw their faces. They hate me, and they are right to hate me. They do not hate you, Nantan said, though his voice lacked conviction. They hate the pain. I am the pain, she said. I am the reminder of everything they have lost. As long as I am here, you are divided. Tacklish will never follow you. The band will split, and Roe will come back. She looked up at him. I have to go. Nantan dropped the rag he was using. He moved across the fire to kneel before her. He took her face in his hands. And where do you go? He asked. To town, to the rope. Elijah will hang you as a traitor. Then I will go to the desert, she said. You will die, he said. Then I die, she whispered. But I do not drag you down with me. Nantan leaned his forehead against hers. He closed his eyes. I have lost my land, he whispered. I have lost my family. I have lost my pride. I cannot lose you. You are the only thing that makes sense in this world of blood. If you go, the part of me that is alive goes with you. He kissed her, desperate and fierce. It was a kiss that tasted of salt tears and rain. It was a plea. We stay, he said. We fight. Together. Maggie held him, listening to the thunder. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to stay in the circle of his arms forever, but she knew the world was not that kind. Meanwhile, 12 miles away in the town of Red Rock, the mood was ugly. The saloon was packed. Men drank whiskey with grim determination. Elijah Carter stood on a chair, his face flushed with self-righteous fury. They have her, Elijah shouted. Those savages have taken a white woman, a Christian woman, and she is suffering God knows what indignities at their hands. He did not mention that she had told him to leave. He did not mention that she had ridden with them freely. To admit that would be to admit she had chosen an Apache over him, and that Elijah could not abide. Captain Rose stood by the bar, nursing a drink. He touched the bandage on his shoulder where the arrow had grazed him. We ride at dawn, Rose said, his voice cutting through the noise. We have the location. We have the numbers. This time, we do not parley. We wipe them out, every last one. The men cheered. It was a sound of bloodlust. Elijah stepped down from the chair. He walked over to Roe. And the woman? Elijah asked quietly. Roe looked at him. If she is with them, she dies with them. Unless you want to try and fetch her out of the fire yourself. Elijah's face hardened. If she has turned, Captain, then she is no longer a woman. She is just another enemy. Roe nodded. At dawn. Then, outside, the rain began to fall on the dusty street, turning it to mud, but it could not wash away the impending violence. The stage was set. The final collision between two worlds was coming, and Maggie and Nantan stood squarely in the center of the storm. The dawn did not break with the promise of warmth. It arrived as a cold, gray bruise spreading across the eastern sky. draining the color from the mountains until the world looked like a sketch in charcoal and ash. The air in the high valley was usually filled with the chattering of jays and the rustle of squirrels in the pine needles. But this morning, the silence was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against the eardrums. Maggie stood outside the wickiup, wrapping her shawl tighter against the chill. She watched the smoke from the cooking fires rise in thin, straight columns, undisturbed by wind. It looked like a prayer that had nowhere to go. "Something is wrong," she whispered. Nantan appeared beside her, his face grim. He did not look at the sky. He looked at the entrance to the valley, a narrow throat of rock half a mile away. "The birds," he said. "They are gone." Moments later, a scout emerged from the tree line. It was the young boy who had panicked at the parley, now moving with a terrified urgency. He ran to Nantan and DeSoto, who sat by the central fire. "Soldiers," the scout gasped, his chest heaving. "They are in the lower wash. They are coming up the goat path." "How many?" DeSoto asked, his voice steady despite the sudden murmur of fear that swept through the camp. "Many," the scout said. 40, maybe 50. And they have the big guns on wheels, a mountain howitzer. They had brought artillery to hunt families. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Mothers grabbed infants. Elders reached for walking sticks. The debate that followed was short and furious. "We must run," Taklish argued, gesturing toward the high peaks behind them. "We can lose them in the scree. They have horses," another warrior shouted. "We have old women who cannot walk. They will run us down like rabbits. We stand and fight." A third man roared. "This is our land. Let them pay for every step in blood." Maggie watched the argument, feeling a sickness rise in her throat. She was the ghost at the feast, the poison in the well. Every soldier marching up that canyon was there because of her. Every bullet that would fly today carried her name on it. Nantan looked at her across the fire. He saw the guilt eating her alive. He started to move toward her, to offer comfort, but a shout from the perimeter stopped him. "They are here." The blue uniforms appeared at the tree line, a long line of them spreading out to block the exit. Sunlight glinted off carbine barrels and brass buttons. They did not fire immediately. They formed a firing line, a wall of calculated violence. Captain Rowe rode forward, flanked by 2 lieutenants. Elijah Carter was there too, sitting high on his black stallion, his face a mask of righteous vindication. A translator, a Mexican man who worked for the army, rode out and shouted in Apache, "The captain says there is no need for blood today. Give us the white woman. Give us the traitor. If she comes out, we will let the women and children go." It was a lie. Maggie knew it. Nantan knew it. Captain Rowe had not dragged a cannon up a mountain to walk away with one prisoner. He wanted the land. He wanted the glory of clearing the territory. But the lie hung in the air, seductive and poisonous. The women in the camp looked at Maggie. Their eyes were pleading. "Go," their eyes said. "Save our babies." Maggie felt her heart slow down to a heavy, deliberate thud. She looked at the children huddled behind their mothers. She looked at the old men who had seen too many wars. She stepped forward. Nantan moved instantly, blocking her path. "No," he growled. "It is a trick. You know it is a trick." "It does not matter," Maggie said, her voice sounding strange and distant to her own ears. "If I stay, they fire now. If I go, maybe it buys you time. Maybe it distracts them long enough for the women to get up the ridge." "I will not let you," Nantan said, gripping her shoulders. His fingers dug into her flesh. "I have lost my land. I have lost my brother. I have lost my wife. I cannot lose you too." Maggie looked up at him. She reached up and cupped his face, her thumbs tracing the hard line of his cheekbones. She memorized him, the scar on his chin, the fierce dark eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead. "Loving you has been the only true thing in my life," she whispered, "and it has taught me that love is not about keeping, it is about saving." She pulled his head down and kissed him, a soft, fleeting touch of lips that carried a lifetime of unsaid words. "Live," Nantan. She breathed. She pulled away from him before he could stop her. She turned and walked toward the soldiers. "Maggie!" Nantan shouted, his voice cracking. But she did not look back. She walked across the open ground, her hands raised in the air. The dust of the camp clung to the hem of her faded dress. The sun beat down on her head. She felt small and fragile against the wall of armed men. The camp watched in silence. Even Taklish lowered his weapon, stunned by the sight of the white woman offering herself to the wolves. Maggie reached the soldier line. Captain Rowe looked down at her with a sneer of triumph. "So, the savagery has not completely rotted your brain," Rowe said. "I am here," Maggie said, her voice steady. "Let the women go." That was the deal. Rowe laughed. It was a dry, ugly sound. "I do not make deals with traitors. Mrs. O'Connell." He signaled to a sergeant. "Bind her!" The sergeant dismounted and grabbed Maggie's wrists, twisting them behind her back. He tied them with a rough hemp rope, tight enough to cut off the circulation. "You have aided the enemy," Rowe announced, raising his voice so the camp could hear. "You have lain with savages. You have betrayed your race and your God. There is only one punishment for treason in the field." Elijah rode closer. He looked at Maggie, at her dusty hair and her defiant eyes. "I gave you a chance, Maggie," Elijah said softly. "I offered you a house. I offered you a name. You chose this. I chose a man," Maggie spat back, looking him in the eye. "You are just a boy with a gun and a bruised ego." Elijah's face turned purple. He raised his hand as if to strike her, but Rowe stopped him. "Save it," Rowe said. "We have work to do." He turned to his men. "Bring up the wagon." A supply wagon was rattled forward. Rowe pointed to a crate in the back. "String her up," he ordered. The soldiers threw a rope over the high branch of a ponderosa pine that overhung the trail. They fashioned a noose. Maggie felt the blood drain from her body. They were going to hang her. Here, now, in front of Nantan. They dragged her to the wagon and forced her up onto the crate. The rough rope scratched her neck as they tightened the noose. The smell of the hemp was choking. Maggie looked up. The sky was a hard, merciless blue. She looked toward the camp. She could not see Nantan. "Any last words, traitor?" Rowe asked. Maggie looked at him. "I regret nothing," she said clearly. Rowe scowled. "Kick the crate." But before the soldier could move, a sound tore through the air. A high, piercing war cry that echoed off the rock walls. "Hokahe!" Nantan appeared on the ridge above the soldiers. He was not alone. He had used the distraction of Maggie's surrender to lead a dozen warriors along a hidden game trail that flanked the army's position. "Fire!" Rowe screamed. Nantan charged down the slope, leaping over boulders, his rifle in one hand, his bow in the other. Bullets tore the air around him, kicking up spurts of dirt. One struck him in the shoulder, spinning him around. But he did not fall. He roared and kept coming, a force of nature fueled by pure, desperate love. The soldiers swung their rifles, panic breaking their formation. Nantan dropped to one knee, ignoring the blood soaking his shirt. He raised his bow. He did not aim at a man. He aimed at the rope that held Maggie's life. It was a shot of 1 in 1,000, a shot guided by the spirits, or by luck, or by the sheer force of his will. The arrow hissed through the air. The broadhead struck the rope just above the noose, shearing through the strained fibers. Snap. Maggie felt the world drop out from under her. She fell hard, hitting the bed of the wagon and rolling off into the dirt. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and the rope burned a ring of fire around her neck. But she breathed. She gasped, sucking in dusty air, her vision swimming. "Get her!" Elijah screamed, drawing his pistol. But the Apaches were upon them. The canyon dissolved into a brutal melee. It was not a battle of lines and orders. It was a knife fight in the dust. Horses screamed. Men shouted. Rifles cracked at point-blank range. Maggie struggled to her knees, her hands still bound behind her back. She saw Nantan cutting through the press of bodies, using his rifle like a club. He was making for her. Rowe intercepted him. The captain drew his saber and slashed at Nantan. Nantan ducked, the blade slicing air, and drove his shoulder into Rowe's chest. They went down together, rolling in the dirt, Elijah saw his chance. He raised his revolver, aiming at Nantan's back. "No!" Maggie screamed. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the dizziness, and threw herself at Elijah. She slammed into his arm just as he pulled the trigger. The gun went off. The bullet went wide. It missed Nantan. It struck Captain Rowe square in the chest just as he was rising to his knees. Rowe looked down, stunned, at the red blossom spreading on his uniform. He looked at Elijah with an expression of utter confusion. Then he collapsed, his face hitting the thirsty earth. Elijah stared at the dead captain. The color drained from his face. He turned his rage on Maggie. "You witch!" he shrieked. He backhanded her. The blow sent her sprawling into the dirt. Elijah raised the gun again, aiming at her head, but a hand grabbed his wrist. Nantan stood there, his chest heaving, blood streaming from his shoulder. His eyes were black pits of fury. He twisted Elijah's wrist until the bone snapped. Elijah screamed, dropping the gun. Nantan grabbed him by the throat and drove him backward. He slammed him against the rocky wall of the canyon, holding him over a sheer drop that fell 50 feet to the dry creek bed below. Elijah clawed at Nantan's hand, his eyes bulging. "Don't!" he choked out. "Please!" Nantan held him there. He held the man who had harassed Maggie, who had led the soldiers here, who had tried to kill them both. Every instinct in his warrior's blood screamed to let him drop, to watch him break on the rocks, to take the vengeance that was his right. He looked at Maggie. She was sitting in the dust, her lip bleeding, watching him. Her eyes were wide, but she did not look away. Nantan remembered what they had said in the mountains. Blood stains everyone the same. If he killed Elijah now, in cold blood, he would be no better than the men who had killed his brother. He would be just another turn in the endless wheel of slaughter. He looked back at Elijah. "You are not worth the death song," Nantan growled. He hauled Elijah back from the edge and threw him onto the ground at the feet of the remaining soldiers. "Take him!" Nantan shouted to the stunned troopers. "Take your dead captain, and go, or you all die here." The soldiers looked around. Rowe was dead. Their formation was broken. The Apaches held the high ground now, their arrows nocked and ready. The fight had gone out of them. A young lieutenant, pale and shaking, signaled the retreat. "Get the horses," he shouted. They grabbed Elijah, who was sobbing and clutching his broken wrist, and dragged him onto a horse. They threw Rowe's body over a saddle. Slowly, backing away with weapons raised, the cavalry retreated down the canyon. Silence returned to the valley, but it was a shattered silence, broken by the groans of the wounded and the crackle of fires that had spread to the brush. The camp was saved, but it was broken. That evening, the council met. DeSoto looked frail, his age showing in every line of his face. "We cannot stay," the old leader said. "They will come back, with more men, with more guns. This place is known now." The band was splitting. Some families wanted to head south, to Mexico. Others wanted to go to the reservation, tired of running. DeSoto looked at Nantan and Maggie. Maggie sat beside Nantan, her neck bruised purple from the rope, her wrists raw. "And you?" DeSoto asked. Nantan looked at the fire. He looked at his people. He knew that even if they stayed, the resentment would linger. Maggie would always be the white woman who brought the soldiers. "We go," Nantan said. "Where?" Taklish asked, not with anger, but with a strange, grudging respect. He had seen Maggie charge a gunman to save his cousin. "There is a place," Nantan said. "A valley to the north. Hard to find, hard to reach. There is water. We will go alone," Maggie added softly. DeSoto nodded. He reached into his pouch and pulled out a small bag of pollen. He sprinkled it over Nantan's head, then, after a pause, over Maggie's. "Walk in beauty," the old man said. The departure was quiet. There were no grand speeches. A few families, those who were tired of the war, those who were outcasts themselves, asked to come with them. A mixed-blood family, an old warrior with one eye. They packed what little they had. Maggie mounted Bess. Nantan rode a roan mare he had captured. They rode out of the camp as the sun set, leaving the smoking ruins of their temporary home behind. They did not look back. The journey to the hidden valley took 2 weeks. It was a pilgrimage of pain and hope. Nantan's shoulder was stiff, and Maggie's neck ached constantly. But every mile put between them and the world of men felt like a victory. The valley, when they found it, was a jewel hidden in the granite. It was a box canyon with a spring that bubbled up from deep underground, feeding a grove of cottonwoods and a meadow of sweet grass. "Here," Nantan said, sliding from his horse. "Here we stop running." They built their life with their hands. It was brutal, back-breaking work. They felled trees to build a cabin, not a wickiup, but a structure of logs and mud that could withstand the winter. Maggie dug the earth until her hands were blistered and calloused, planting the seeds she had saved in her pockets: squash, beans, and the apple seeds she had dreamed of. Nantan hunted. He learned the patterns of the deer in this new place. He shaped poles for the roof. He tanned hides. They learned the rhythm of each other. Maggie learned that Nantan hummed a low, tuneless song when he was working leather. Nantan learned that Maggie liked to sit and watch the sunrise with a cup of hot water before she spoke a word. They laughed at their mistakes. A roof that leaked. A stew that was too salty. The laughter was the true medicine. It healed the places inside them that war had hollowed out. Winter came, turning the valley into a bowl of snow. The storms were fierce, howling down from the peaks, but the walls of the cabin held. One night, the wind was particularly savage. The fire roared in the stone hearth Nantan had built. The cabin smelled of pine sap and drying herbs. Nantan sat in a chair he had fashioned from willow branches, rubbing his leg. The cold still made the old bullet wound ache. Maggie walked over to him. She did not ask. She knelt and began to massage the muscle. It had been months since she had done this. The context had changed entirely. It was no longer a desperate act in a cellar or a fugitive's necessity under the stars. It was an act of peace. Her hands moved with a familiar grace, strong and sure. Nantan watched her face in the firelight. He saw the lines of age and hardship, the gray creeping into her hair, and he thought she was more beautiful than the sunrise. He reached out and took her hands, stopping them. He pulled her hands to his chest, pressing them against his heart. "Maggie," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "every time you touched me, back in the cellar, back in the mountains." "Yes," she whispered. "I felt like I was drowning," he said, "and your hands were the rope. You pulled me back. You pulled me all the way back from the dead." Maggie looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "And you gave me a reason to breathe," she said. He pulled her into his lap. The embrace was not frantic. It was not born of fear. It was slow and deep. They kissed, the firelight dancing on the walls, and the wind outside ceased to matter. They moved to the bed in the corner, a mattress of pine boughs and furs. They shed their clothes, shedding the layers of the world, the Apache warrior, the white widow, the enemies, the outcasts. They were just Nantan and Maggie. Their bodies met with a tenderness that was almost painful. It was a claiming. It was a promise. Every touch was a word in a new language they were writing together. In the warmth of the cabin they had built, amidst the snow of a harsh land, they finally, fully, belonged to each other. Seasons turned. The snow melted into rushing creeks. The grass turned green. Maggie's seeds sprouted, stubborn little flags of life in the stony soil. Word spread, as it always does in the wilderness. A white woman and an Apache man living in the high country. Some cursed them, but others came. A black cowboy named Silas, tired of being told where he could not drink and where he could not sleep, rode in one day and asked if he could water his horse. He stayed for 10 years. A Mexican girl, fleeing an arranged marriage to a cruel man, found her way to their fire. They became a community of the broken, the lost, and the brave. 5 years later, the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent strokes of red and gold. The peaks of the mountains looked like jagged teeth biting into the heavens. Maggie sat on a bench outside the cabin. She was thinner now, her face etched with the lines of the sun, but her eyes were clear. She was watching a small apple tree, barely waist high. That was fighting to survive in the wind. Nantan sat on the ground at her feet. He was whittling a toy for the Mexican girl's baby. He leaned back, resting his head against Maggie's leg. Absently, out of a habit born of 1,000 nights, Maggie's hand dropped to his hair. She stroked the coarse, dark strands, her fingers moving with the gentle rhythm of a healer. The world down below, in Red Rock, in Tucson, in Washington, was still full of hate. Men still killed each other for land and for pride. But here, in this high, hidden valley, the wind was quiet. Nantan reached up and covered her hand with his. He did not speak. He did not need to. Their love had not been a wildfire, burning bright and dying fast. It had been a root, a gnarled, stubborn root that had found purchase in the rockiest soil imaginable. It had weathered the drought, it had weathered the storm, and now, against all odds, it was blooming. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and the heartache of the American West, and I hope Maggie and Nantan's story touched something in you. I would love to know where you're listening from today. Please leave a comment below and tell me which part of the world you call home. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of grit, romance, and survival, please make sure to subscribe to From Wild West. And finally, I would truly value your thoughts on the ending. Did Nantan make the right choice in sparing Elijah? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for your time. And until the next story, keep your powder dry.